William, Washington and Moscow don't see eye to eye on Syria, starting with the fact that they disagree on the cause of the Syrian conflict. The White House has made clear that its take is that Assad started the conflict and therefore needs to be replaced. How do they find common ground?
Well, I think the president said earlier in reference to Cuba and America's relationship with Cuba, the new one, saying if you've tried a policy over the years and it hasn't worked, time to change. And I think with respect to our policy as it pertains to ISIS or ISIL in Syria with Assad as well, hasn't worked. So I think there is a commonality and a shared goal here, and that is to defeat ISIS, but also, as far as the United States is concerned, to eventually see Assad removed from power. So I think there's an opportunity to bring that about. But I think the Russian president put President Obama in a very difficult spot by increasing military assistance, putting aircraft in, heavy armor in, and air defense missiles in. I think that changes the game in terms of what the United States options are. I think that the president is going to have to make a decision, and that is either work with Russia, work with Iran, or stay the course, which is a failure to date.
Sir, is this a question of, at least in the geopolitical sphere, the enemy of my enemy is my friend? The U.S. wants to remove Bashar al-Assad from power, but the Assad government is actually fighting the Islamic State militant forces. So what's the United States to do at this point?
Well, as I said, I think the president is going to be in a position of having to make a choice. He can say, I'll work with Russia, even though we have very different goals. I once had a professor who said, if you have ideals without technique, it's a mess. It can be a mess. But if you have technique without ideals, you have a menace. And I think what the president laid out is if you have simply the application of power without ideals, meaning respect for human rights, for the values that we treasure as the American people and have universal values, then you're going to continue to have conflict in various parts of the world. I think China and Russia have a very different set of values in terms of non-interference in another country's domestic affairs. President Obama said you can't have the slaughter of innocent people and say it's a matter of internal or domestic affairs only. I think that's where Russia, China will disagree with the United States, and where I think the world community has to come together in response to Pope Francis and the great speeches he gave at the United Nations to say we've got to find a way to work together harmoniously and not simply with the application of power.
Right. William, can you tell us if there's any linkage between Putin's pushing for a deal on Syria with the lifting of Western sanctions? What is his end goal there when it comes to the sanctions that have debilitated Russia's economy?
Well, I don't think we should lift sanctions against Russia, not until there's a change in Russian attitude and what they've done in Crimea, not until they stop trying to destabilize Ukraine. Until that takes place, I think the president is right to keep the sanctions on. With respect to dealing in Syria, I think there's an opportunity to say Russia is going to be there. And I think President Putin is very clear on this. Nothing good is going to happen as long as you exclude Russia. That's our client state, and we're going to support it. As a matter of fact, what is, I think, unacceptable to me, but the reality is that more and more of the Gulf states, more and more of even NATO countries are looking to President Putin to be the solution to the problem and not to the United States. That's very discouraging. So I think there's been a shift in terms of people looking at the United States as being the prime mover of trying to bring about a reconciliation and a peace. They're now looking to President Putin, many of them. So that's not a positive factor from my perspective or from the White House's.
Sir, we have some comments from President Putin and how he feels that his country has been tackling terrorism. I'd like to play that for you and then get your response.
Russia has always been consistently fighting against terrorism in all its forms. Today we provide military and technical assistance both to Iraq and Syria and many other countries of the region who are fighting terrorist groups. We think it is an enormous mistake to refuse to cooperate with the Syrian government and its armed forces who are valiantly fighting terrorism face to face.
Mr. Secretary, what are your thoughts on President Putin's comments there?
Well, I think he's glossed over the fact that they haven't been exactly helping to fight terrorism by moving militarily into Crimea, also destabilizing Ukraine. So they haven't been fighting terrorism, they've been sponsoring it in that area as far as I'm concerned. But with respect to terrorism that's facing Russia, yes, they have some real serious challenges that they've had to face in the past and will continue to face if the Middle East continues to boil over. They have a number of people coming from Russia who will now go to Syria, become war-hardened, then come back into Russia. So Russia has an interest in bringing about a solution, but the ultimate solution has to be Assad will go, because what could be a greater act of terrorism than Assad dropping barrel bombs upon innocent civilians? That's an act of terrorism, and he's supporting that and actually reinforcing the military support for the Assad regime. So I think he can't have it both ways, saying they're fighting terrorism at the same time supporting acts of terrorism against innocent civilians.
Very last question here for you, William Cohen. The backdrop for all of this, of course, is that Russia's economy is struggling, and it's certainly been suffering from low commodity prices and also Western sanctions. Is Vladimir Putin more unpredictable when oil prices are at 130 or when they're at $45?
Well, you don't like to see Russia that's too strong, and you don't want to see a Russia that's too weak. Having Russia's economy really decline substantially and put the president in a position of having to look for external rationales for why his economy is failing can put him in a very difficult position, and he can respond militarily, or certainly sparking even more nationalism than he currently does. So I think you want to see Russia that has an economy based upon free markets and pursues policies that he's talking about today, namely, let's find ways of working together. If we do that, I think it's in our interest to have a Russia with a really viable economy. The same with respect to China. We don't want to see a China that's so big that it really intimidates the rest of the countries in the region, over in the Asia-Pacific region. By the same token, we don't want to see the economy fail either. That would not be in China's interest or ours or anyone else on the planet.